unlike Dan, I haven't been in the UK since 2003. When I left, it was a country with two-party politics, and everything. There was a red team and a blue team, and a few yellows in the middle, and we all knew where we stood. Since then, I've been in South Asia, in New Delhi, and then in China, and then in the last 3 or 4 years here in DC. So increasingly, I look at Britain from afar, and I'm always curious as to what Americans make of what's going on in Britain, particularly now, because it is really changing. So yeah, unlike Dan, I haven't been there for a long time, and I look at it with an increasingly foreign perspective, I suspect.
Scheherazade Rehman, I'm a professor at GW, George Washington University. I'm the director of the EU Research Center at George Washington University, and a professor of international finance. My main work, and I guess through this discussion, is about the austerity issues in the EU and the economic future and the financial future of these countries. The UK elections are definitely an interesting point in EU politics as a whole. Clearly, who wins might influence the way the UK engages the rest of the EU, and that is economically and in other ways. And that does impact the US with some respect, with at least the defense aspect of how it engages in foreign policy.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Leigh. I'm a former official of the European Commission. I was there for many years, actually, in different capacities. Most recently working on the enlargement of the EU, the accession negotiations with the new countries. And I'm now an advisor at the German Marshall Fund in the United States here in Washington. I work on various European themes, Britain and the EU, obviously, but also external relations, foreign policy, particularly the European neighborhood policy. I follow developments in the Eurozone quite closely, so quite a range of European issues. And being here in Washington and working for GMF, which is dedicated to transatlantic cooperation, I also look at the implications of these developments for the US.
And you'll be chairing our discussion on the UK elections.
Yes, indeed. I gather we're scheduled to begin
Yes.
in a few minutes, is that it?
We can begin now. We just started live streaming.
Okay, all right. Would you like to begin now?
Yes.
Okay. What I thought was we would divide our discussion this evening into several parts. That we might first look at the situation leading up to the elections and look at the record of Mr. Cameron's coalition government and the manifestos of the different political parties, their claims as to what they would do if they were elected. And then we might put our heads together and do some informed speculation as to what the outcome of the elections could be, and then consider the implications of that. So if that's agreeable to you, I suggest we begin by a few words on developments over the last 5 years, particularly viewed from here in Washington. What do we think about the current state of Britain, the achievements of Mr. Cameron's coalition government, and preoccupations here in Washington? I contributed last week to a piece produced by Carnegie Europe that was looking at the state of the so-called special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. And a number of real concerns were expressed on that occasion. I won't go into them right now because I'd like mainly to hear from you. But how do things stand, do you think, from your viewpoint now, just 10 days or so before the elections? Who would like to intervene on this subject?
I'm happy to kick off if that helps. We missed introductions, but I've been based here for a couple of years as the bureau chief for The Guardian here, but I used to be the national editor in London for The Guardian, so I sort of followed the beginning of the coalition, if not the end of it. And I think what's interesting from a US perspective, particularly, is how economically focused this election has been, and a very interesting sort of test case in austerity economics and deficit reduction being pushed as the primary focus of the coalition government. I don't know how many of you remember the sort of the dark days after the banking crisis. They coincided with the last UK election, and the coalition that was formed between the Tories and the Lib Dems was very much sort of forged in a moment of a crisis, frankly, and people really did worry that we were. I think people didn't quite realise in the outside world just how precarious the UK finances were at that moment in time, and whereas the UK being hit by the same banking crisis that hit the US, the difference was that we didn't have a reserve currency, and there was a very serious risk of a run on the pound. And that happened, the UK election happened almost at the darkest days of that. I mean, the economy just began to turn the corner, but there was a row when the elections were too tight for any one party to form a majority, and a coalition was on the cards. The market started to panic, and there was a real sense that, you know, something had to be done very, very quickly, and it was all about stability. So this election is, to my mind, has become a sort of vote on whether or not that worked, whether or not the pain that a lot of the country felt that it had to go through was justified. And the Tories have run very strongly on kind of it being that we've turned the corner, and the job picture looks quite rosy. And Labour have fought very hard on this being unnecessary austerity and actually an excuse for ripping apart of the welfare state, an ideologically driven exercise in rolling back 50 years of welfarism in Britain. And some on the Tory right would celebrate that. You know, increasingly it's become a sort of twofold exercise: one, stabilising the national finances, and another one, correcting what many people felt had become an overly sort of strong state. So the complication has been the arrival of two other parties into the game. The UK Independence Party, particularly strong in.
Should we stay with the economy for a moment?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. I'm rambling away.
Developments, but let's pick up on some of those points you made. So the Conservative Party goes into these elections with the claim that its fiscal consolidation has succeeded. It's quite ironical that in the course of this government, Mr. Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister, found himself challenged of all institutions by the IMF to some degree, that argued from a more Keynesian perspective that expansionary contraction is a contradiction in terms. And there were almost tensions between the government and the IMF. But here they are now, with the economy growing at around 3%, although the last quarter that reported showed a somewhat diminished growth rate compared with 12 months previously. And do you think it's convincing to the electorate, anyone around the table who wishes to intervene, that these policies are perceived as having been successful, and therefore the government can go into the elections feeling confident that the electorate will consider they are best placed to handle the economy?
Well, I think that the voters would like quicker results. That's clear. I think you need to step back a little bit. You know, what happened in the aftermath of the financial crisis that began in 2007 was very devastating. I mean, we had a crisis here in the United States, which was the largest crisis we've seen in 80 years. Europe not only fell in that crisis, but then had another one on its own in 2010, which is the sovereign debt crisis. The UK, fortunately, did crisis management a lot better than anybody else did on continental Europe, as we have seen. And part of that has led to their success in terms of having roughly between 2 and 3% growth. As you can see, there is zero growth in most of the EU continental countries, negative growth in some, and barely 1% in most others. Austerity measures were seen by the marketplace as something that was necessary in Europe. And when there is a panic and a crisis, markets don't care whether you're Portugal, Spain, Greece, you all look the same. And so the UK government by default was almost forced to implement austerity. It was different than what had happened in the rest of Europe. Having said that, they did one thing that the Europeans didn't do, and that is crisis management. They followed the US suit and provided liquidity into the system. That liquidity forestalled more serious repercussions in terms of investments being pulled back. And here we are now, 7 years into this, 8 years into this, and the pound is stable. The economy is going back. The UK has the largest capital markets in the world. The financial markets are still viable. Investments are coming in, and they look nothing like Spain or Italy or some of the other countries.
Okay, so that they can boast that they've done a good job. Yet, a little bit as in the United States, the voters don't seem completely convinced by this. And as in the US, where you have relatively low unemployment, UK only 5.6%, but also a lot of very low-paid jobs, and you've got growth without median incomes increasing. So many voters are really skeptical about this claim. How do you feel about that?
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, actually, from an American perspective, the Americans have been on the Germans' case to invest more in infrastructure, actually to open the spigot, right? And in fact, from an American perspective, the British austerity was something that never happened. Quantitative easing, interest rates are still low. There was talk about raising them, 2 or 3 years ago, and here they still are at flat rates. In lots of ways, it was the austerity that never happened. It was sold as austerity, but in lots of ways, it's actually a QE-led growth story. I think what's interesting for British voters, and this is as a result of what's happened with the SNP and what happened in UKIP, is that I suspect a lot of British voters would like to vote for the status quo, which is a Tory government with a Lib Dem break, a sort of a leftish break. But there is no way for them to do that. Do British voters want? I mean, if you look at the SNP, who are going to prop up the Labour Party, which is the Scottish Nationalist Party, right? And you look at their spending proposals, 170 billion pounds. They run an £8 billion deficit if they were enacted. Do British voters want that? I suspect they don't. Actually, I suspect British voters are pretty clear that we couldn't live on an entirely credit-based society. People were burnt by what happened in the credit markets, and I suspect that actually, I mean, I don't know what you feel, Ben. You may be closer to it than I am, and maybe that's a very international perspective. But I suspect the kind of anti-austerity spending plans that are being advanced by the SNP and the kind of economic fudge that would be required to prop up a Labour government would upset a lot of English voters.
I'd like to stay with the record for the time being and then come to the perspectives in a few moments. Maybe moving on from the economy, but also with the view from Washington. I mean, what does the record look like in terms of Britain's relations with the United States, Britain's standing in the world, Britain's contribution to NATO, and Britain's partnership with the United States in the wider sense? Viewed from Washington, is there any continuing sense in the notion of a special relationship, and how has the performance of the British government over the last 5 years played into that?
Disastrously. I do think, unlike Dan, I wasn't in the UK until 2 years ago. I've been out of the UK. I've been watching the UK struggle, from the perspective of China, etc. And the narrative, I think, is really interesting. You had Britain feeling the cold shoulder of the Obama administration, very much a Pacific-looking administration, really feeling that in the first term, pressing the administration to get more involved in Syria, getting very frustrated when Donald went to all the capitals during the election, said there's nothing doing. There was a point where Ambassador Ford and Clinton and Gates were kind of indicating that there would be some US involvement in Syria. Obama put the shutter down, and then Cameron failed to whip that vote in Parliament. And a lot of people were surprised by the lack of appetite among British citizens to get involved in Syria. Notwithstanding, Philip Hammond, who was then Defence Secretary, came here. Dan, you were probably in that briefing, I may not rather, and said, you know what? As soon as you guys put TV pictures of children dying and writhing from gas on the screen, then there will be a change of heart. Then we will be prepared to enforce red lines. Of course, that's not what happened. And I think ever since then, you've seen frustration in the White House. You know, Cameron ran the summit calling for 2% of GDP on NATO spending, and now make the commitment. You know, where does Washington go when it needs real movement on Ukraine sanctions? To Angela, not to Dave. You know, he has marginalised himself in Europe, pulled the Conservatives out of the EPP group, and you know, launched a referendum to save his own skin, to fix a domestic problem, which was to have to deal with the Eurosceptics on the right. When you bundle all that together with historical problems, the failure of the British Army in Basra, the failure of the British Army in Helmand, still strong intelligence, but there is a real sense, talking to people in Washington, of how, you know, the Brits have, you know, are drifting away. And you look at the French, right, who have that actually, you know, doing stuff in Mali, still have an ability and a willingness to project power, although ironically with a socialist prime minister, you know, and you can see how the Brits, you know, are starting to get marginalised. I will say this: it's a two-way street, right? So the Americans the Obama administration clearly in the Middle East is buying into an any man for itself world, a G0 world. They can skin the cat any way they like, but the basic policy is increasingly, you know, that it's any man for himself. And so when you could argue when the Brits, for example, joined the Asian Development Bank, infuriated Washington. But in a world where it's any man for himself, can the Brits be blamed for taking a self-interested decision about their trade, you know?
Well, I think there was a moment when the tactics around that grabbed a lot of attention because the Brits wanted to be the first to join. In fact, they were the second because Luxembourg jumped in further. But then all the other major member states of the European Union also indicated that they were going to join.
Traditionally, we would have stuck with him. We wouldn't have done that. I don't think in the world that existed before Obama, I just can't see how that we, just from a politics point of view, we wouldn't.
Well, there clearly is a big disparity over China. And Cameron has been criticized to some extent for dropping, let's say, all the values issues, the human rights issues vis-a-vis China, going with large delegations of business people, not even raising some of these issues. The US, on the other hand, through TPP and by other means, is more intent on isolating China. And perhaps, you know, the golden mean is somewhere in between. But certainly there's a big divergence between Washington and London on how to handle China. And I think that's one of the things that has emerged over the last few years. Another huge challenge right now, of course, for Europe, but for the United States as well, is developments in Eastern Europe, particularly Ukraine, and the first time we've really seen open warfare in Europe, in Yugoslavia. And one of the main comments that has been made during this period has been the absence of the Brits from the scene. Do you think that's something that is felt in Europe, in Washington, sorry?
You know, you mentioned that it's every man for himself. Well, quite frankly, when the crisis hit, it was every man for himself in Europe, in the United States, and in the UK, because the crisis was so deep that people did retract.
The financial crisis.
For the financial crisis. A lot of this is stemming from that aspect. When you've got the middle class taking a 40% wealth hit across the board, you know, their appetite to go to war or engage overseas diminishes. And so you have to pander to that. So we know that in both both countries here and across the pond, this issue of income inequality is taking front page news. And the joblessness numbers, no matter how good they are, we know that they're erroneous in the sense that there is a lot of hidden unemployment in the system or underemployment in the system on both sides.
But there is an irony in that many European states have been hit very harder than Britain, in a sense, by the economic crisis, but not all have lost the appetite for foreign policy to the same degree. I mean, the Minsk process, for what it's worth, I mean, certainly the Germans and the French have been very active. From time to time, the Poles have participated, but Britain has been really notable by its absence.
Yeah, and Britain very good, because I used to be based in China. You know, when I was in China, which was, you know, from 2008 onwards, the Brits were in lockstep on the value stuff with the Chinese. And the Chinese did what they always do, which was that Obama saw the Dalai Lama, and they literally put the Brits in the deep freeze, and they did it full on for nearly, I mean, I know that speak to the diplomats, and we hardly got meetings. Now, they don't dare do that with the Americans, but there was a time when American value leadership, American determination to see China grow as a responsible actor, not to isolate, but see them grow, to create the conditions that would see China grow responsibly, and required people not like the Brits, reliably like the Brits, not to take short-term selfish economic decisions in order for setting longer-term rules of the road that will guarantee global prosperity, without which will not be achieved without China, without helping China get rich before it gets old. It's such a symptom of where Obama's taken the world and how Britain's reacted to it, that we of all countries, Britain and America, are not in lockstep about that issue.
But I think I agree with your description of how the special relationship feels particularly frayed at the moment. But I do think that it's not just Britain that the US is realigning itself with. There's an awful lot of other traditional allies, whether it's Israel, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Pakistan, who also feel kind of slightly bewildered by the Obama foreign policy. And I think the Obama foreign policy is a very pragmatic one rather than a loyal one. It's not one of sort of, traditionally it's kind of like, the Western alliance was a very static thing, and you knew which side you stood on. And I think the way Obama is approaching Iran or Cuba or Syria is very much sort of an ad hoc, let's fix some problems that need fixing, but it's not about, you're on my side and you're on the other side. And that is a bewildering thing for a lot of diplomats in Washington, a lot of traditional allies. But I think it reflects the multipolar world we're moving in. The West is broke, to your point. The West doesn't have appetite for fighting endless wars. This particular administration is doubly determined not to sort of be the global policeman. And, everybody is searching for a role. I think Britain is not unique in that. Britain is probably fairly typical.
Our publics, as America's public, right? I totally get that our public don't have the appetite. We can't afford it. The difference, I think, for Britain, and this goes to the election, is that actually in a G0 world, in a world where everyone is retrenching, and America prospers in that world, right? It may not prosper in the same way that it did, but America prospers in that world because it has a big, diversified economy, has a younger population, has immigration, has a tech base. Its traditional allies, Japan, Israel, as you say, Britain, strategic raison d'etre, rested on American coattails. We suffer, and I'm not sure the British public, because there's been no discussion in the election, I don't think the British public gets quite the cost long downstream of what's going on.
Of course, it's very unusual for foreign policy to be a major issue in an election. I mean, here too, for that matter, unless it affects the daily lives of the electorate to some extent. Now, in the last few days, the Labour leader, Ed Miliband, has tried to inject foreign policy into the debate, mainly talking about the debacle in Libya. Do you think this will succeed? Do you think he'll manage to convince the electorate that the Tories are mishandling foreign policy? Or do you think this looks just too much like an electoral gambit?
He's definitely picking up on the whole immigration asylum issue, because we know that a lot of this has to do with the unrest in Libya and the chaotic situation in Libya, which has sort of really fast forwarded this whole immigration issue. I mean, April 19th, 700 people died. This makes headlines, and he's probably going to make that link that they had something to do with the resulting immigration and asylum issues at this point.
And British journalists who are famous for their hard talk, pushed Miliband to say, are you claiming that the Prime Minister has blood on his hands? And he refused to answer that. But how do you think this will play out?
I think it's a very legitimate point to make. I mean, I think the specifics of Libyan refugees are very different from the sort of broader economic drive that is forcing migration across a lot of the rest of North Africa, or across a lot of the rest of Africa. And we basically screwed up that country. I mean, there was a very poorly executed intervention after, the third, fourth fifth intervention in a Muslim country in as many years that was equally poorly executed. And I think we continually fail to learn our lessons, which is you go into these countries expecting to clean up a mess by dropping bombs, and you end up making an even bigger mess. And you've only got to look at Iraq and Afghanistan and to see we're not learning from our lessons. And I think that Miliband's one of his big claims to fame was that he stopped the Syria vote that would have done that again in Syria. And I think although you're right, the Americans that I spoke to at the time were slightly bewildered because they sort of think, well, what did that came out of left field? They didn't have any warning of that. But it got Obama out of a hole as well. It gave him a reason to pause. He was going to lose a vote in
this is the desperate situation we're in. It got Obama out of a narrow little domestic political hole. And
it stopped another dreadful Western intervention.
Or it stopped another dreadful, or it aided the absolutely historic dissolving of red lines, right? So you have a situation where there have been chemical weapons treaties since the First World War, where the President of the United States says, if we see a mass use of chemical weapons, there will be reprisals, right? Nothing happens, right? That is the beginning of why of the rise of Putin. It is and Obama tied himself in knots. Kerry made a throwaway line at a press conference. Putin, which after the event was sold as strategy when it was nothing of the kind. This is the President of the United States, and we, Ed Miliband, of all the people, right? Cameron would have had blood on his hands if he'd sat back and let Gaddafi massacre a city. Right?
No, but the point is that
could I suggest that we don't get too deep?
In a nutshell, it's rich coming from Miliband. He's right, but it's damn rich coming from Miliband, the man who stabbed Cameron in the back over a Syria vote when Cameron tried to show leadership on foreign policy, and Ed stabbed him in the back, and then he comes out and says, how dare poor Dave didn't stand up to.
I think we could have a long debate about this, but let's bring it back to the elections. Will these issues play out at all, do you think, in voters' minds? You suggested it would be through the migration issue, or is all of this just too far away for most voters to pay attention?
I don't think foreign policy has been, apart from this one point that you make about the Libyan migration, I don't think foreign policy has been a feature in this election.
I didn't mean the Libyan migration. I meant the Libyans facilitating excessive migration for human trafficking.
The trafficking was there before, but with the breakdown of the regime, of course, the controls are now infinitely weaker, and we see these terrible, tragic incidents because law and order is simply broken down in Libya, and one could argue to some extent that the government shares some responsibility for that. But I agree, this is not likely to be a very salient issue for the electorate. What about turning of the special relationship, so to speak, and that is the economic relationship between Britain and the United States, mutual trade and investment, and the negotiations that are fitfully underway for the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Now, is this something that could attract anyone's interest and attention, or is this also too much taking place behind closed doors, too uncertain for the time being to be an issue in the record of this government that some voters might pay a little attention to anyway?
I think it will erupt in British politics. I think we're slightly behind the curve compared to America. I think there is already a very vigorous debate in Congress about whether trade for trade's sake is good for all Americans. There's no doubt that economically trade helps, but the distribution I think is becoming a big issue. There is a feeling that free trade agreements around the world generally benefited the rich and businesses, and that is getting a good airing in Washington. I don't think that has yet to get a good airing in the UK, but I think it will over time. I think people are increasingly feeling that, especially after the banking crisis, the game is rigged, and I think the expression you're seeing of that is actually popping up in these fringe parties, popping up in UKIP, popping up in a increasingly socialist sounding SNP. But this rage, this sense that the game is rigged, is echoed in US politics on the right and the left, whether it's sort of the Rand Pauls or the Elizabeth Warrens, and I think that our equivalent of the Rand Paul and the Warrens is the SNP and UKIP, and people, everybody is going, hang on a minute here, we bailed all these bankers out, we have a broken system and nothing is changing. And I think that anger, whether it's through trade or through other issues, is going to increasingly bubble up. It's not going to go away.
I think it's a no-win either way for British investments, because if Cameron wins, then he's promising a referendum that's going to scare the hell out of the investors. In terms of investment coming into the UK, banks will simply move to other locations like Frankfurt or Paris. On the other hand, if you've got the Labour Party coming in, again, you're talking about budgetary issues. You're talking about perhaps a slowdown in the economy. We don't know at this particular juncture.
Perhaps, for the benefit especially of those in the United States who are following this discussion, I mean, what are we to think about the different parties' programs as they go into the elections? Is there little to choose? For Me Tooism between the two main parties, Labour and Conservative, with differences only on the margin. We could come perhaps to the smaller parties a little later on. But what are the salient features of the programs of the two main parties that differentiate them the most?
Well, there's the perception and there's the reality. I mean, I think the perception is that Labour stands for spending and the Tories stand for austerity. I think the reality is that the Tories have been tracking back quite rapidly in the last few weeks. As the polls show them slipping behind. They're sort of, George Osborne, the Chancellor, is suddenly finding another $5 billion or so for the NHS in a back pocket that he'd forgotten about, and I think there's a lot on the left in the UK who would say that Labour has been far too mealy-mouthed and not very forceful in expressing the alternative. That these are two parties scrapping it out over tiny differences in spending levels. And I think that's one of the reasons why you're seeing the rise of these alternative parties. They don't have particularly coherent agendas, but people feel that they're not getting viable alternatives from the two main parties.
It's one of the driving forces of the sort of homogenization of politics. Is actually there's so little fiscal wiggle room. That if you elected the monster raving looning party, a venerable British institution, but if you elected the monster, you couldn't actually do that much different from the other guys. And it's interesting, in this country, there isn't that much fiscal room either. So, but you have a bifurcation of politics on social issues and on racial issues that you don't have. And so in the UK, so Tony Blair, when I grew up, Michael Foot and Margaret Thatcher were knocking it out, and the unions were being crushed, and Britain was becoming a modern country. And it was the sort of the life of the left and the right. Now, in a post-Blairite world, we live in but that's also contributes to public apathy, political apathy, because actually the needle doesn't move that far depending on who you live. And the rise of fringe party, the end of two-party politics, and I suspect. It's interesting that we consider ourselves a two-party system, because the last time, there was a 4-day hiatus and there was a coalition and it sort of functioned. I think this time we really will see, very likely we'll see minority governments of one stripe or another. And it's interesting, we thought that channel protected us from being like the rest of Europe, and we wake up now and discover that, like lots of the rest of Europe, we're in the thrall to minor parties, we're in the thrall to a kind of breaking up, a kind of surface chop in politics, where we're obsessed with narrow. I mean, you go back to the trade agreement. We have a situation where it looks like the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is going to happen, and the negotiations. We talk to people up on the Hill about the negotiations with the Europeans. The TTIP, the transatlantic deal is going nowhere, and people up on the Hill see very little appetite from the Germans and the French. See, the French actually more So the Germans again.
But Obama said that he would hope to reach an outline agreement at least by the end of this year. Let's wait and see, but let's not get too much into
But
that.
does Europe want it? Does Europe appreciate what a world looks like without?
I agree.
TTIP?
This is an important
Can I
issue,
just
but
add something? I think
please
that
do,
we're,
yes.
we're forgetting that, the United States is almost an $8 trillion economy, and the UK is less than 3 trillion. And we understand history and where the UK was. The new reality is that, both candidates are giving the impression that they're big enough to sit at the table by themselves. And perhaps may not be the case without the EU.
right.
And I think that is a reality check, that they are trying to give the persona that we are big enough to sit at the table. But the issues are roughly the same on both, about a two-party system here. And we know that going into this election, UK may look like the rest of Europe and be a coalition government from here on in. But the issues are the same. One party promises never to raise taxes, and the other one, so that we can help you because you got hurt recently.
And the Conservatives now are even promising to enact a law between now
That's
and the
exactly
elections.
right, with no new taxes, income tax, I think it's insurance tax, and there's the VAT.
So
and
no read my lips.
That's exactly right. But on the other side, you've got the Labour Party saying, we know you've been hurting, we're here to help, because we understand the hurt that happened after this crisis. So basically approaching the same constituency from different angles. It's just...
I think that one of the big things that worries me, though, going into next Thursday is that we don't have a constitution ready for coalition politics. We have an incredibly arcane system where the Queen invites a Prime Minister to form a government, and everybody assumes that would be the party with the largest number of seats, but none of it's ever kind of, agreed in advance.
It's actually a fascinating moment. We live in a constitutional monarchy, but there is a very narrow area of discretion at this point that the monarch can exercise. So probably this is the one remaining area where the Queen still has, if not power, at least influence.
And I think what really worries me, it's going to be incredibly messy, because Labour have already said they don't want to form a formal coalition with the SNP, who may have the balance of seats. They've also ruled out a sort of less formal coalition, which would basically avoid a vote of no confidence. And they may well try and form a minority government, which is a government that can't pass laws without persuading members of the other parties to join them on a sort of ad hoc day-by-day basis. So this government may just limp through for 6 months and may have to force another election. We're in totally uncharted constitutional territory.
Before we get into that, and I would love to get into that in just a few moments, but for the sake of mainly our American and other international participants and people listening in, could you just briefly characterize the smaller parties? Who are we talking about? We're talking about the Liberal Democrats, we're talking about the Scottish Nationalists, we're talking about the United Kingdom Independence Party, maybe Ulster Nationalists.
Greens.
Yeah.
I mean, could you just perhaps briefly characterize these parties? What do they stand for? Are they just minority protest parties?
You can do UK, and I'll do SNP if you like.
Yeah, okay.
Please go ahead.
So if you think of on a left-right spectrum, that we have the Conservative Party, who are themselves on a spectrum between sort of centrist Conservatives, like David Cameron would be one, but they have the perennial problem of their right-wing, anti-European right-wing, who've been appeased by this promise of a referendum for 2017 if David Cameron gets it. Now,
The British Tea Party, right?
They are, in a nutshell.
in a nutshell. Now, to the right of that Conservative Party spectrum, there has arisen the United Kingdom Independence Party, which is an anti-European, out of Europe party, kind of our equivalent of pitchfork politics. It's old white pot-bellied Britain, who, like a lot of the sort of Tea parties, in a fairly incoherent way, sort of feel fed up that the world has moved on and not really taken it with them. It comprises some Tory anti-Europeans, which is why they're, it's interesting. They might only get 1 seat or 2 seats, but they will poll nearly 10% on current polls. Like 3 million voters will vote for UKIP, right? Which is an amazing thing, actually. The UKIP made a big mistake by talking about their seats. They might win 4 seats, 5 seats. Actually, because of our first past the post system, they might actually only win 1 seat. But they may well get 10 million votes. That's 10 million pitchfork politic votes of a mixture of Tories who are disaffected with the Tory party not being anti-Europe enough, and what used to be the British National Party, which is sort of old-fashioned Marine Le Pen, Front National, kind of pretty racist old Britain. So
and a lot of Labour voters. That's what I think is.
And there's a horseshoe there, isn't there, between disgruntled blue-collar Labour voters and disgruntled Tory voters who kind of meet right around the other end of it, which yeah.
But maybe a little less toxic than the National Front. I mean, in that they have one issue. I mean, the racism aspect is less strong.
What happened was Nigel Farage, the UKIP leader, one of his big things is we put the BNP out of business. But if you talk, for example, I was talking to Owen Paterson, who's a Midlands MP from Shropshire, where I was born and come from, and he will tell you the UKIP members in his constituency, which is half rural and half urban, failed urban constituency, right? And he says, you go and talk to UKIP members in the rural areas, and they're Tories who want the end of Europe. But when you get into sort of Telford, Wolverhampton, which are these old ex-industrial, like your Midwest, I guess, you get in there, and they are basically previous BNP members, British National Party members who vote. So that's why the party gets so much trouble, right? Nigel tries to kind of have a sort of pint and fags. Yeah. Pint, that's the wrong word in America. Pint and cigarettes, blokey kind of this, and then inevitably, one of these people pops up, and they're all about,
So it's a party that is not entirely a single-issue party, but it's mainly these days arguing for withdrawal from the European Union, but it shades into the extreme right with aspects of nationalism, and even you're suggesting some former extreme right wing, and perhaps some.
It's the Telegraph House view, but
and some dropouts from the Labour Party as well.
Yeah, I have a slightly more charitable view, in that I do think they're a protest party, and I think they're a protest at both Labour and Tories, and they're not particularly coherent, and there are aspects of them that are quite unpleasant, but I don't think it's necessarily fair to compare them with Front National in France, whatever. I think they were born out of a concern about an uncontrolled boom in immigration, but a concern that actually quite a large chunk of the political spectrum now shares. I mean, there was a sort of broken immigration system to the extent that took everybody by surprise. So I'm no fan, but I do. But
it does contain those elements, doesn't it? I mean, Nigel Farage talking about his little HIV statement. It's pretty nasty dog whistle politics. That.
Yeah.
I mean, actually,
they're the Ted Cruz of the British politics.
Well, on that note, the Liberal Democrats, what do they represent in the political spectrum today?
Well, they're a slightly busted flush. I mean, I think the trouble was that their high point was about 2 months before the last election, when Nick Clegg, this face from nowhere, suddenly performed very well in debates.
Former colleague of mine, by the way.
Yeah, well, face from Brussels.
Not quite, no.
He was a very effective MEP, but he did extremely well in the debates, which was the first time that debates had played a big role in a British election. They were a total import from America, and they slightly upset the apple cart, because suddenly everybody was latched onto this kind of new interesting figure in the middle, and he appealed to Labour voters who thought he was actually to the left of Labour on many issues, and ended up surprising many people by forming coalition with Tories, mainly because the arithmetic wouldn't allow a Lib Lab coalition. And as a result, when the Tory government became associated in many people's eyes with this very, very kind of austere ripping apart of the welfare state, a lot of people blamed Clegg on the left for not for not checking that enough, and a lot of people on the right and the Tories kind of found it increasingly irritating because they kind of felt that he was just a sort of check on their agenda. So he's ended up this kind of tragic figure that may well lose 3/4 of his seats, I think. Now,
is that because he's taken such a distance from his base and he seemed to have abandoned some of the parties?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the trouble is the expectation of a junior party's power in a coalition and the reality are so out of step. I mean, the thing is that even in the last election, they only won about 40 or 50 seats, I think. So 58. So, you know, although the Cameron had to make him deputy prime minister, it's a bit like Joe Biden. I mean, this man is not full of power and influence, and so.
I remember Johnson's comment was about the powers of the vice president. I won't repeat it in polite company, but let's move on to the Scottish nationalists. I mean, the title of the party would give the impression that they too were a single issue party, but that turns out not quite to be the case. They're being described now increasingly as a left-wing party, some of their domestic policies, as well as some of their foreign policies and positions on defence. Who would like to jump in to characterize the SNP for the sake of our participants and listeners?
Well, I'll have a go. I mean, I have a slightly less charitable view in that I think that they are analogous to UKIP in the sense that I think they're the Scottish version of English nationalism, and I do think though that nationalism is the overriding sort of feature, and that most of the rest of their politics is largely opportunist. And I say that because for a long time the SNP were after the Thatcher government and the Tories basically sort of got wiped out of Scotland, they were the Labour Party in Scotland, and they were seen as a sort of fairly sort of, you know, more like UKIP, a sort of a kind of party of small businessmen and people who kind of wanted, you know, shot of London, but were no rabid socialists. They were in the Labour Party, and then I think in the run up to the independence referendum, they very smartly realised that actually there's an awful lot of rage and anger about the economy that you could tap into if you tacked to the left, and so they ran a very strong campaign, I think, as a sort of quite a radical party that would kind of, you know, promise the earth if there was independence, they'd be able to live off North Sea oil forever and kind of build 1,000 hospitals a day, and it would all be sort of peace and harmony. And that didn't quite work, but almost worked and shocked everybody and slightly frightened everybody. But having lost the referendum, I now think there's a sort of almost like a wrecking tactic going on, which is, you know, we haven't been able to get Scottish independence, but Michael, we're going to bring down Westminster. And there is a very cavalier view, which, I mean, Nicola Sturgeon, who's a very effective politician, who's been probably the star of this campaign, of this election, who's the new head of the SNP. She's not a Westminster MP. She's not standing in this election herself, but she runs a party that may nevertheless have the deciding vote. She may well be the Nick Clegg of the next coalition, although she won't be able to be in it herself because she won't be an MP. So they have an enormous opportunity to kind of just generally be mischievous, and I think having lost the independence referendum in quite bitter circumstances, I think will be incredibly mischievous.
Do you share this rather critical view?
Well, we don't. You mentioned the Queen, so let me mention kingmakers.
Yes.
Right? The Scottish National Party very well might be the next kingmaker. We know this race is going to be very close between the two major parties, and we know that they're leaning a little bit to the left. That gives them a little bit of an advantage. I think they ran a campaign that tapped, as you said, the rage, and that's something not to be ignored. So they are a force to be reckoned with in this election.
Do any of the other small parties merit a mention?
The Greens are interesting, not because they'll be decisive in any particular way. They may lose their one seat, I think, but because they also have had a moment in the sun in terms of sort of media interest and kind of like some kind of idealism on the left, which I think is just interesting because it shows how bored everybody is with Labour and Conservative. I mean, people are willing to entertain some pretty kooky candidates.
The SNP phenomenon is that nobody quite saw it coming, that as a result of this, they lost the referendum by 10 points, the Scottish independence referendum. But by what happened was they ended up absorbing all of the independence votes, whereas the side that won, kind of its machine was fractured between Tories and Labour, the Labour Party, and so everybody suddenly woke up to the fact that the SNP now had this voter list, had this machine, and had an axe to grind, and a lot of this is why they're decimating Labour. They may win 50 seats, and a lot of the big Labour fish are going to find themselves on the beach, and the reason that is that of course a lot of the old Labour, which would be the more left-leaning, were really upset with what happened in the referendum, and Alistair Darling and these spivvy new Labour types coming from London and telling them how to screwing up their independence hopes, and so they of course all transferred to the SNP. So almost overnight, Cameron, another one of Cameron's great wheezes, granted a referendum that's created a monster, and I do think that it will really, if there's a wrecking ball, socialist-leaning SNP party keeping Ed in number 10 in a minority government and doing economic deals that require English people to subsidise Scotland, there is a real recipe for English nationalism.
I hope he will avoid that.
I do think, as somebody who believes in the Union, actually, that the United Kingdom, talk about the balkanisation of Europe, but and England, United Kingdom punching its weight, it would be a disaster if the UK broke up.
It would indeed. But before we jump into that, thank you for characterising the different players in this election. Let us now do some hopefully informed speculation as to what the outcome of the election might be. And let's do a little table round amongst us. What is our best guess as to the outcome of the election in the light of the opinion polls, the debate, the discussion? It's often said that there'll be no winner, that it's most unlikely that any party would have a majority. Let's each of us perhaps say a few words about what seems to us to be the most likely outcome that we might expect.
I think most likely outcome is we'll all be wrong, because it's one of it is one where all of the scenarios are within the margin of polling error. So that I think is the first thing to be said. The second thing I think is that I have a sneaking suspicion that Labour won't do quite as badly in Scotland as anticipated. And my own reason for saying that is that all the polling was showing, or at least a lot of the polling was showing before the referendum, the SNP were going to win, and they didn't. So I'm a little sceptical about the polling accuracy in Scotland. Having said that, I think Labour will probably just hit the Tories in terms of actual numbers of seats, and will be faced with this unpalatable prospect. And the three scenarios: one is a formal coalition. One is
coalition between whom?
A formal coalition. Well, between on the assumption that the Lib Dems get largely wiped out, and that forming coalitions with three Ulster Unionists and the Green MP or whatever just gets too messy. I think it does come down to whether or not Labour either form a coalition with the SNP, or they form this kind of coalition light, which it's called they call it confidence supply, which basically means you agree to back the government up in two scenarios: one, if there's a vote of confidence in the House, and two, on budgetary matters, which is seen as just enough to allow the government to kind of limp along. And then any other bills, an education bill or a defence bill or whatever, would be free-for-alls, and Labour would have to kind of rely on some Tories to prop them up. So that would be a very unstable. There's an even more unstable scenario, which is a minority government, where they would say, bugger off to the Scots, we're going to try and do this on our own, and would hope to persuade Tory MPs to join them bill by bill, literally legislation by legislation, in a way more like the US system. I mean, I think there's a great fear about this in the UK, because we've had years and years of prime ministers being able to basically do whatever they wanted to, because they've had big majorities. Well, I think we're moving into a scenario where Parliament will become a law unto itself, literally. I mean,
you said that the Liberal Democrats would be wiped out, but I mean, maybe they will retain some votes. I mean, some seats, maybe 20, maybe 15, maybe 10. I mean, couldn't the arithmetic work out that that might make all the difference?
Yes, it's quite. I mean, I think if the trouble is that the votes may be. I mean, I think it's conceivable that they could form a coalition with the Lib Dems and still be 5 or 10 seats short of outright majority. So yeah, yes, I haven't seen any scenarios where people are suggesting that a Lib-Lab coalition on current polling would be big enough to form a majority government.
Do you agree with this?
I mean, I think that we're all into a great wave of hypotheticals. I'm not going to disagree with anything Dan's really said. I think, if you look at the polls this way, there is also, you get a Tory minority government, where historically the Tories, because people don't like to admit to pollsters they vote Tory, the Tories tend to outperform where they were on polling day. So let's say the Tories, right now, both parties, main parties, 270, say, right, 326 or 324 is the magic number. Let's say the Tories, for a majority, let's say the Tories get to, 285, right, or 287. And you have a situation where the Lib Dems, no one quite knows how the UKIP vote holds up when it's really confronted on polling day. Historically, minority protest parties, I do think the Tories have a good point about, the English don't like the Scots. If you look at a map of England, the red bits, the Labour bits.
We might have given them that idea, actually.
Yes.
But
if you look at a map of England, right, the Labour bits are in London, the northeast, central Yorkshire, the north, the urban northern pockets, and in London. The rest of it's blue, and then the rest of the map in Scotland is yellow or SNP. Right? I do think Ed Miliband is his ratings have risen, but he's still underwater. Most politicians go into office on a wave of popularity, and then we watch them. Ed is not a man who the British public wants to be prime minister. And Ed Miliband, propped up by a Scottish nationalist government who frankly just gets up the nose of most English people, is a pretty unpalatable prospect. So I just advance the idea that actually you end up with a minority Tory government where the Lib Dems get 30 seats, not 15. The Tories get 280, 286, and then you've got the DUP, the UKIP. Obviously the Lib Dems will not go into coalition with UKIP, but UKIP. Quietly, DUP is the also used, but I think that's unlikely, but I do think it's possible. But I do think Ed Miliband will, morally speaking, be in a weak position to form a government.
So this, just to understand this hypothesis, this would be a minority Conservative government with the smaller parties making up to the necessary majority of 326, the Lib Dems, Ulster, or would it remain a minority government?
It might well remain a minority government, but the Tories will have, if the Tories have significantly won the most seats, right? So let's say the Tories get 290, right? And Labour get wiped out in Scotland and get 265, 270. That puts Ed Miliband, an unpopular non-prime ministerial figure, in a really tough position when it comes to laying moral claim to be the Prime Minister of Britain, because we still live in a world internally, us Brits, where the Prime Minister is the leader of the country. We don't have a presidential system, we don't have of government or politics, but he's still the leader of the country.
But this is where I think our constitutional weakness could result in a very, very nasty situation, because I think that that ambiguity puts a huge onus on the palace. In a way that people will be very suspicious of. And I also, and again, people can't come to this, I think it puts an enormous amount of power in the media, who are already very, very shrill on the kind of the warning of the sort of dangers of Ed. And let's not forget, one of the big divisions between them has been press regulation, where Ed Miliband was one of the few British politicians, to my mind, with the balls to stand up to Murdoch during the phone hacking situation, and has promised regulation. So you will have the Daily Mail and the Murdoch Empire, and I'm afraid to say the Telegraph, screaming blue murder in those days after the election, saying, my God, we've got to get Cameron.
Because it is in English media, right? it's the United Kingdom, but Dan's absolutely right about that. It's an English media, and the English do not want a weak prime minister in Ed Miliband, both numerically and personally, as he's perceived, being wagged by a wrecking ball Scottish Nationalist Party. I do think that is a recipe for real rancour in a way that you haven't actually seen in British politics. Real rancour.
Only to be matched by the rancour if that Fleet Street coalition puts a minority Tory government into power without powers.
So perhaps Labour
Not since the poll tax rise.
Labour is being led by the wrong Miliband. David Miliband had a lot more political oomph, as one might put it, to give Labour, but that's not the case here. Bottom line is no single party is going to win a majority, and you're right. Both your scenarios are right. This is a difficult situation. The only thing, this is like predicting oil prices. You don't do it on air.
Right.
I think the only certainty here is increased market risk because of this.
Yeah.
There is going to be uncertainty and volatility because we know no party is going to win the majority.
Right.
Well, the market is not priced into the market now, is it?
Not
The
yet.
market is sanguine as we
Yeah.
speak.
Not
Yeah.
yet. But hopefully this show will raise the awareness of that.
Well, let's now look at the implications of these outcomes. And by the way, if anyone around the table would like to jump in with a question or a comment, please raise your hand and I'll bring you into the discussion. But let's look at an issue that we've only referred to indirectly, but having spent some 34 years of my life in Brussels, I'm not uninterested in it. We know that Europe is an issue that divides the parties, very salient to the electorate. I mean, it comes really towards the bottom of the list of issues that the electorate is concerned with. But I would say of all the issues, perhaps, it's the one that seems to distinguish the parties the most clearly. So what would actually happen if we have, for example, a Conservative minority government? We know that Cameron has promised that if he's the next Prime Minister, he will hold a so-called in-out referendum on EU membership in 2017. First question is, if he's the leader of a minority government, will he be in a position to honour this pledge at all? Will he be able to get act through Parliament providing for a referendum at all? If not, perhaps he might secretly welcome this as a way out? Or would he nonetheless hold a referendum? And what is likely to be the drift of events if he is able to hold a referendum? We can come to the other hypothesis in a moment of a Labour-led government, but how would you see things panning out on this issue?
Well, major disruptions, I would say. If he's able to hold a referendum, and that's a big if, and let's say if the referendum falls in favor of leaving the EU, which I doubt it will, because it'll put enormous negative pressure on exporters, from automobiles to pharmaceuticals, not to mention investments coming in and banks leaving London and reorganizing themselves somewhere else.
Possibly.
But you have to ask yourself why they're doing this, right? They're doing this because there's so many of these other pressures, the immigration pressure, the bureaucracy of the EU, this whole issue of open borders where UK jobs are taken. So there's a political dimension to the referendum. But in the totality, if I'm looking from the outside in, a referendum to leave the EU is just, in my mind, a dumb one.
I'm more sanguine, mainly because I just go and see it happening. I think that this is mainly this is a function of internal Tory party politics more than any sort of groundswell in the country to leave. This is a sort of reaction to the rise of UKIP, and Cameron was bounced into this promise at a time of weakness. I think the Scottish referendum has shown us that British voters are naturally risk averse when it comes to major constitutional change. There's a sort of inbuilt kind of.
You don't think they vote to leave, or they don't think there will be a referendum?
Well, neither, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that Cameron will do absolutely anything in his power to avoid one, and as you're right, a minority government would be a perfect excuse to avoid it. I think the thing it might play a role in is if Cameron isn't the next Prime Minister, there's going to be a Tory leadership challenge from Boris Johnson that may well divide down EU lines.
This is the thing, is that regardless of whether it's a referendum, Cameron promised the referendum to get himself out of a hole with his own party, right? If there's a Labour government or minority government, the issue festers.
Because then there's no referendum.
Yeah, there's no referendum, and the Tory party, argue, even splits. I mean, if we're going to enter a world where the British public are going to get more and more accustomed to minority politics, you could see a world actually where the Tory party splits.
Yeah.
And you get a Eurosceptic wing of the Tory party called, Tories for Britain, and then you end up actually with what you probably, which is a rump of Cameronite wet Tories and Blairite New Labour in coalitions. You end up with a new, not down that. And Cameron in a minority government, okay, he has an excuse not to have a referendum. Does that shut up the 1/3 of his party?
I think it slightly depends on how UKIP poll. I think one of the determining factors will be if you, as you say, it's not down to the number of seats they get, but if they get a huge number of votes, if there seems to be a potent political force, then I think the pressure will be back on the Tories to sort of adopt this.
You're going to go back to the major years. You're just going to have a situation.
So you've got a situation where, in all probability, nobody wants a referendum here, and even if they do hold one, the chances are, imagine a world where we're sitting at a table and you've got China sitting here, you've got the US sitting here, you've got the EU sitting here, and this little seat you've got the UK.
You're saying there is a seat at the table. I'm not sure that seat will be there.
I think, but before we take this as read that we will be in that situation, I think all the new MPs who are elected through the selection process are likely to be strongly Eurosceptical. So aren't we likely to have a House of Commons with the Conservative Party overwhelmingly Eurosceptical? Would there be a rump? Would there be a significant rump of pro-Europeans?
Certainly the last couple of elections have seen a new breed of younger Eurosceptic Tory MPs coming through. And to kind of, just to sort of play devil's advocate and to kind of, I think, justify some of the Euroscepticism at the moment, they have looked at the performance of Europe over the last 5 years with horror. I think, it wasn't that long ago that we were, weeks, months away from Tony Blair taking us into the single currency. And you really got to look at what's happened since to say many people in Britain and all very grateful that didn't happen. So there is, I think, the Euroscepticism of old was a slightly kind of little England, kind of like we can recapture empire and go it alone thing. I think the more modern Euroscepticism is born out of a genuine feeling that the European project is quite badly broken.
Yeah, but there's a big difference between joining a single currency and keeping the pound versus leaving the EU for trade issues.
Yeah.
I would agree.
Yeah.
But I think there is a sense in which George Osborne deciding to sign up to the China's Asian Investment Bank, Development Bank, for example, I think is a classic example of a type of Tory that would much prefer to be more flexible in how it aligns itself. They're not a Tory that thinks that Britain is going to recapture and conquer the waves, but a Britain that is basically forms its own strategic alliances.
But Britain exports more to Ireland than it does to China, Brazil, and India combined.
Yeah.
You have a situation, and this is where the irony of Europe is that Europe is balkanizing into exactly what you're seeing in Britain, these protest parties, but actually increasingly in a digital economy, it's never been more important that Europe comes together, and events are driving Europe together. So whilst they're talking about repatriation and renegotiation, actually the euro crisis has eventually forced the ECB to back European bonds. It's actually, and a Grexit standoff is actually going to deepen European economic integration. The crisis in the Ukraine, it took a long time for Merkel to get angry Italians and get everybody in for sanctions. But actually, if you look at that as an entity, again, another issue where Europe is having to the immigration in the Mediterranean issue. Again, a pretty weak showing from Europe, but it only works if everyone works together. So we're only moving in one direction.
I think this is a case of half full, half empty. I mean, you might well be right, but I mean, one could also make the opposite case. And on Ukraine, you know, if you look at Mr. Orban, if you look at the Austrians, if you look at Mr. Renzi, the Bulgarians, the Slovaks, and others, you do see quite a diversity of view. And when the sanctions come up for review in June, I wouldn't like to bet exactly how that will fall out. But just to stay with it for a moment, and in the time remaining to us, let's imagine that Cameron is Prime Minister. He does find the votes to get a referendum act through the House of Commons, and then he engages in a mini renegotiation with the other member states of the European Union. What would the outcome be? If there were a referendum in 2017, would the British voters be so conservative and afraid with a small c and afraid of an uncertain future that when they go into the ballot box, they will nonetheless vote against leaving the EU? Or is there really a significant risk or possibility, depending on your perspective, that they might vote to leave?
I think that they'll probably vote not to leave because the risk is huge in terms of investments and business when it comes down to it.
Yeah.
I do think there's a huge gap between reality and public opinion. You know, there's a poll that showed that 75% of Europeans thought that corruption was rampant in the EU. But actually, if you look at the audit, it's 0.2%, it's about the same as the US federal government. There is a real publicity gap. I do think, actually, in the end, contemplate filling in customs forms to go on holiday to France. When they start to look at immigration as a two-way, you know, Brits living in Spain, etc. When they start to look at the freedom that British businesses have because of our levels of opt-outs to hire without regulation compared to the French and the, you know, if one of the problems is the argument, and the press is responsible for this because the press is infantile about Europe, if the arguments really took place, because I mean maybe there needs to be a referendum. Maybe people actually need to really think about what happens if we leave. Go back to your point about when you're in a room with China, America, you know, where did Britain think it will be?
I think that's a positive scenario, which is that actually it's not like a renewal of marriage vows. There's a referendum and it gets won quite convincingly, and it becomes a sort of actual sort of affirmative. Because I think that's another. A lot of people's beef about Europe is also that it is this sort of undemocratic sort of super state, and I think that. You know what the upside of a referendum would be a sense of participation, a sense that people were actively saying that we want to stay.
But they're not alone in this. You know, if you've been in the EU structure for long enough to know that any time there's pressure in the system, and usually it's economic pressure, two entities get blamed. The EU bureaucracy gets blamed, and immigration gets blamed right off the bat. You know, they just go from that.
But I think a lot of Brits feel about Europe in the same way that Americans feel about Washington. It's sort of, I think most people kind of get that it has to be there and that there isn't really another alternative. Right. But it's a great whipping, it's a great sort of symbol of somebody else's blame.
And perhaps last of all, looking at the years of a Labour government with the support at least of the SNP, we know that some of the positions taken by the SNP on security and defence would give cause for concern to Washington, I think. And I mentioned the little piece about the special relationship published by Carnegie Europe. And in preparing for that, I spoke to a number of people here for whom defense is a crucial issue. And the fact that the UK is not pulling its weight, is way below the 2% target GDP for defense expenditure, notwithstanding increased risks, whether in the south or in the east. But in addition to all of this, the SNP is in favor of getting rid of what we used to call Britain's independent nuclear deterrent, at least not renewing the Trident submarine program. So do you think that such a government would cause concern here in Washington in terms of security, defense, NATO, and so on?
I think it will cause concern. I'm not sure it should. I think that a Labour government that allowed itself to be blackmailed into giving up nuclear deterrent is a Labour government that would never form a government again. I mean, I don't think, you know, the Tories would rip them to shreds and they would never come back for it. So this is one of the reasons I think Miliband has been very coy about refusing to coalition, because on the current manifesto, the SNP say, you know, we do want them to try. There's no way they'd hold another election before they let that happen. I mean, I personally am quite ambivalent about Trident. I have big misgivings about it, but within the mainstream of British politics, it is not. It is seen as essential, and it certainly is not something that could be kind of given away as a bargaining chip to get Labour into power, because that would just backfire. I think.
Agree?
I do basically agree with that. I mean, I think it's something that the nationalists can hang out there, and it's something they can give away. If there is going to be this deal, it'll something that they will have to park. She wants. They want fiscal autonomy, but they don't actually, right? Because if they were given fiscal autonomy, they'd actually have to pay their own way, then Nick add up, So I think I don't think Washington will really think that suddenly Fast Lane is going to be shut, and Britain's nuclear subs are. I mean, like you, I'm ambivalent on Trident, since I don't think we can afford it.
Mm-hmm.
We need to spend the money that we spend on Trident on a deployable force that makes us relevant. If we are going to stay with a stake in world affairs, which we're rapidly losing, we need the money.
Thank you. A last word?
Well, I think that definitely, the U.S. will have a more reluctant partner in engaging in its own foreign policy agenda overseas in terms of coming on board. But given the retraction
Under Labour, you mean?
That's right, under Labour. But given the retraction of this administration from foreign policy, that may be not such a big issue at this point. But where it will change the debate, I believe, is immigration in Europe. That will change under Labour.
I'd like to thank our three panelists very much indeed for your contribution. I certainly have learned a lot from the discussion myself, and I hope that that's true of everyone who's been listening in. I think we can say that this will be one of the more interesting elections that will decades in the United Kingdom. We hope the British people show wisdom in their choice. Watch this space. It'll be very interesting to see the outcome in the evening of the 7th of May. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. What kinds of impacts has Boris Johnson had on the election thus far? And that was tweeted from Daniel Scheherazade.
Well, I have no inside track in terms of, but one thing I can say is that, Boris Johnson sort of masquerading as a convinced Eurosceptic. I remember his father as a colleague in the European Commission. I believe he went to the European School in Brussels. And it may be opportune for him in terms of British politics now to strike this pose. But I just wonder how deep it really runs. We didn't discuss whether he's likely to take over as leader of the Conservative Party or not in the event that the Conservatives lose. This might happen, but I certainly have doubts as to whether his Eurosceptical convictions run beyond populism and obvious opportunistic benefits for the moment. But okay, well, thanks again to everybody, and look forward to another such discussion in the not too distant future.
Thank you.